from the ashes of a divided nation. A new party was born, a movement that would redefine freedom, power, and the very soul of America. This is the story of every Republican president. From Abraham Lincoln to Donald Trump, a journey through 170 years of leadership that shaped the United States. Abraham Lincoln, 1861 to 1865, the first Republican president. In the heart of the American frontier, a man rose from a humble log cabin to the highest office in the land. A man whose life would define the meaning of freedom itself. His name, Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States and the first Republican to hold that title. Born in 1809, deep in the rugged backwoods of Kentucky, Lincoln's early life was one of hardship and labor. He split rails, worked farm fields, and educated himself by the dim light of a fireplace. Books were rare, but his hunger for knowledge was endless. From these humble beginnings, he developed a moral clarity that all men, regardless of birth, had the right to rise. He became a lawyer in Illinois, a storyteller, and a debater. But what set Lincoln apart was not his wealth or connections. He had none. It was his unyielding belief that America's promise of liberty must belong to everyone. By the 1850s, the nation was splitting apart. The question of slavery tolerated for too long had ignited a firestorm. As new states entered the Union, bitter debate erupted. Should they be free or slave? The Democratic Party fractured. Out of that chaos, a new movement emerged, the Republican Party, born in 1854 to stop the expansion of slavery. Lincoln's clear moral voice made him the face of that movement. In 1858, his debates with Stephen Douglas electrified the country. Though he lost that Senate race, his words, "A house divided against itself cannot stand," echoed in every corner of the nation. In 1860, Lincoln was elected President of the United States. But his victory triggered fury in the South. Before he could even take office, 7 states seceded from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. By the time he reached Washington, the country he was elected to lead was already falling apart. Lincoln entered the White House not as a conqueror, but as a caretaker of a fragile dream. He believed the Union was sacred, that democracy itself depended on its survival. Then, in April 1861, war came. Confederate guns opened fire on Fort Sumter. The Civil War had begun. The nation tore itself apart. Brother against brother, state against state. Lincoln faced impossible odds, a divided cabinet, untested generals, and a people unsure if this war was worth fighting. Yet, he never wavered. He spoke not of vengeance, but of purpose. That government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Lincoln's leadership during the war was defined by both resolve and compassion. He replaced incompetent generals, found in Ulysses S. Grant a leader who could win, and learned the art of total war, not out of cruelty, but necessity. He expanded presidential powers, suspended habeas corpus, and took bold action to preserve the Union at any cost. But Lincoln's true greatness came not just from military victory. It came from moral courage. On January 1, 1863, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. With a stroke of his pen, he declared that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were free. It was a document of war, but also of justice. It transformed the fight for union into a fight for freedom, and it changed the very meaning of America. For the first time, the United States was not just defending its borders, it was defending its soul. By 1864, the war was still raging. Lincoln faced re-election in the darkest of times. Many thought he would lose, but victories at Atlanta and Gettysburg turned the tide. The people chose him again, a vote of faith in a man who refused to give up. In his second inaugural address, Lincoln did not celebrate triumph. He spoke of sorrow. He said, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds." Those words still define the American spirit. But peace came at a terrible cost. In April 1865, as Union victory finally came into view, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. There, he was shot by Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth. The president died the next morning. A stunned nation wept. From the White House to the smallest village, bells tolled. Black and white Americans alike mourned the man who had promised and delivered a new birth of freedom. Lincoln's death was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of his legend. He became the symbol of unity, of moral leadership, of what America could be at its best. To the Republican Party, he became the North Star, the measure of all who would follow. To the nation, he became its conscience. Today, more than 160 years later, Lincoln's words still echo through time. Those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves. He reminded the world that leadership is not about power, it is about purpose. That progress is not about wealth, it is about humanity. From the log cabin to the White House, from the Civil War to emancipation, Abraham Lincoln carried the weight of the Republic on his shoulders and saved it. He gave America not just victory, but vision. A vision that freedom is worth every sacrifice, that unity is worth every battle, and that even in our darkest hour, the light of liberty will never die. Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator. The first Republican president of the United States, and the man who taught a broken nation how to be whole again. Ulysses S. Grant, 1869 to 1877, the soldier president who fought for peace. The guns of the Civil War had fallen silent, but the wounds of America were still open. The Union had been saved. Slavery had been abolished, but the country stood on uncertain ground, divided, fragile, and angry. Into that fragile peace stepped a man who was not a politician, but a soldier. His name was Ulysses S. Grant, the hero of Appomattox, the man who had forced the Confederacy's surrender, and the next Republican president of the United States. Grant was born in 1822 in Point Pleasant, Ohio. Quiet, humble, and almost shy. He was not a man of speeches or ambition, yet he carried a quiet strength that would define his destiny. As a young West Point graduate, he served in the Mexican-American War, where he learned the harsh realities of command. After the war, he left the Army, struggling to find his place in civilian life. He failed in business, endured hardship, and worked to support his family. Few could have imagined that this quiet, unremarkable man would one day hold the fate of the nation in his hands. When the Civil War broke out, Grant returned to service. He rose rapidly through the ranks, commanding victory after victory at Fort Donelson, Shiloh, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga. By 1864, President Abraham Lincoln appointed him commander of all Union armies. Grant was relentless. His strategy was simple but brutal: strike, pursue, and never let the enemy rest. It was his determination that finally forced Robert E. Lee to surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865. Grant became a national hero. To millions of Americans, he was the man who ended the bloodiest conflict in their history. When Lincoln was assassinated, the nation mourned. But it was Grant who remained the symbol of Union victory, a living reminder that the Republic had survived. By 1868, the country was desperate for stability. Reconstruction had begun, and with it came fierce debate over the future of the South and the rights of newly freed African Americans. The radical Republicans in Congress pushed for equality and protection for freedmen, while Southern Democrats resisted fiercely. In this storm, the Republican Party turned to the one man everyone trusted, Ulysses S. Grant. His campaign slogan was simple: "Let us have peace." It captured the longing of a weary nation. Grant won easily, carrying most of the North and securing his place as the 18th President of the United States. When Grant entered office in March 1869, he was only 46 years old, the youngest president since the founding era. His mission was clear: to rebuild the Union, protect freedom, and enforce justice. He was not a career politician, and he knew it. He once said, "I have never been a politician, and I hope to never be one. But his moral clarity and military discipline gave him a powerful sense of direction. Grant's presidency began with a bold push to secure the gains of Reconstruction. He supported the 15th Amendment, which granted African American men the right to vote. He sent federal troops to the South to protect freedmen from violent resistance. And when white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan rose in terror, Grant struck back hard. Under his leadership, the Enforcement Acts were passed, giving the federal government the power to arrest and prosecute Klan members. It was the first time the United States directly confronted domestic terrorism. Grant's firm action crushed the Klan at least for a time and preserved the fragile progress of freedom. Yet Grant's presidency was not without struggle. The country was still scarred by war and bitterness. His trust in friends and subordinates often led to corruption within his administration. Scandals like the whiskey ring and the credit mobilier affair tainted his reputation. Though Grant himself was never personally corrupt, his honesty was unquestioned. His loyalty to dishonest men became his weakness. Still, beyond the scandals, Grant's presidency achieved remarkable things. He stabilized the post-war economy, restored the nation's credit, and pushed for a civil service reform that would one day reshape government. He signed the Civil Rights Act of 1875, guaranteeing equal access to public accommodations regardless of race, a measure decades ahead of its time. Grant also looked outward. He sought peace not only at home, but abroad. He avoided war with Britain through the Treaty of Washington, which peacefully resolved disputes over Civil War and naval damages. It was a triumph of diplomacy that proved the new United States could solve conflicts without bloodshed. Under Grant's watch, the nation's railroads expanded, industry boomed, and the western frontier began to transform. But it was also during his presidency that the federal government's treatment of Native Americans deepened the tragedy of displacement and broken promises. Grant's so-called peace policy aimed to reduce violence by placing tribes under church-led supervision. Yet even with good intentions, it failed to stop exploitation and suffering. By 1873, economic troubles struck. The Panic of 1873 triggered a severe depression. Banks collapsed, businesses failed, and millions lost jobs. Grant, loyal to the gold standard, refused to inflate the currency, believing stability would bring recovery. It was a painful but principled decision, and one that reflected his soldiers' sense of discipline. Endure hardship, stay the course, and hold the line. When his second term ended in 1877, Grant left the presidency weary but proud. His administration had made mistakes, but his devotion to justice for African Americans and his defense of national unity were unshaken. He had done what he believed was right, even when it was unpopular. After leaving office, Grant and his wife Julia traveled the world. They were welcomed as heroes wherever they went. Kings, emperors, and common people alike came to see the man who had saved the American Union. He carried himself with humility, always more soldier than statesman. But life after the presidency brought hardship. Grant invested his savings in a firm run by dishonest men. When it collapsed, he was left penniless. Then, tragedy struck again. He was diagnosed with throat cancer. As death approached, Grant turned once more to duty. He began writing his memoirs, hoping the profits would provide for his family. He wrote day and night, even as pain stole his voice. With every page, he relived the battlefields, the men he commanded, and the burdens of leadership. He finished the manuscript only days before his death in July 1885. His personal memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant became an instant success and remains one of the finest works of military literature ever written. When he died, the nation mourned again, as it had for Lincoln 20 years earlier. More than 1 million people attended his funeral in New York City. They came not to honor a perfect man, but an honest one, a soldier who had fought his country's greatest war and then fought for its peace. Ulysses S. Grant's legacy is often misunderstood. History remembers his scandals, but too often forgets his courage. He was the president who crushed the Ku Klux Klan, defended black civil rights, and proved that the power of the presidency could serve the cause of freedom, not just politics. He was the man who showed that victory in war means nothing without justice and peace. To the Republican Party, Grant represented perseverance, the will to protect liberty when it was under threat. To the nation, he represented unity, the strength to hold together even after unimaginable division. From the battlefields of Vicksburg to the Oval Office, from triumph to tragedy, Ulysses S. Grant never sought greatness, it found him. He once said, "The will of the people is the best law." He believed in that law with every fiber of his being. He was the soldier who became a president, the warrior who became a peacemaker, and the quiet man who led a noisy nation through its most difficult years of healing. Ulysses S. Grant, the soldier president, the defender of Reconstruction, the man who kept the promise of Lincoln alive when the world was ready to forget. Rutherford B. Hayes, 1877 to 1881, the president who ended Reconstruction. The year was 1877. The Civil War had ended more than a decade earlier, yet the country still trembled from its aftershocks. Reconstruction, the bold experiment to rebuild the South and secure freedom for millions of newly emancipated African Americans, was crumbling under political fatigue, racial violence, and growing Northern indifference. The nation longed for stability. It was weary of conflict. Into this exhaustion stepped Rutherford Burkhardt Hayes, a man of quiet dignity, moral discipline, and deep sense of duty. Rutherford B. Hayes was born in 1822 in Delaware, Ohio. He lost his father before he was born, was raised by a strong mother, and educated at Kenyon College and Harvard Law School. From his youth, Hayes believed in honesty, moderation, and hard work. He built a reputation as a principled lawyer and abolitionist who defended fugitive slaves in court. When the Civil War came, he volunteered to fight for the Union. In uniform, Hayes proved himself courageous and steady. He was wounded multiple times, but never left the field until victory was secured. By war's end, he had risen to the rank of brevet major general. His bravery earned the admiration of his men and the attention of the Republican Party. After the war, he served as a congressman and then as governor of Ohio, where he promoted education, prison reform, and the rights of freedmen. By 1876, the Republican Party needed a candidate who could unite its divided factions and restore public confidence after the scandals of the Grant years. Hayes was no firebrand, no demagogue. He was seen as honest, reliable, and above reproach, a man who could heal a wounded party and perhaps a wounded nation. The election of 1876 would become one of the most disputed and dramatic in American history. Hayes faced the Democratic nominee, Samuel J. Tilden, the governor of New York, a reformer with a strong following. When the votes were counted, Tilden had clearly won the popular vote and appeared to have the Electoral College as well. But in several southern states, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, both parties claimed victory. For months, the nation teetered on the brink of chaos. Accusations of fraud filled the newspapers. Armed militias drilled in the streets. Some feared another civil war. To resolve the crisis, Congress created a special electoral commission, 15 men tasked with determining which votes to count. In the end, by a single vote margin, the commission awarded all the disputed electoral votes to Hayes. His opponents cried foul. They called him Rutherford and his fraudulency. Yet behind the scenes, political bargain had been struck. The compromise of 1,877. In exchange for Democratic acceptance of Hayes's victory, Republicans agreed to withdraw federal troops from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. Hayes took the oath of office privately on March 3, 1877, and publicly the next day. The Union was preserved, but the cost was enormous. The protection of black rights in the South collapsed almost overnight. Hayes entered the presidency under a cloud of suspicion, but determined to restore integrity and moral purpose to government. His inaugural address struck a tone of reconciliation. "We are not enemies, but friends," he said, echoing Lincoln's words. He pledged to govern with fairness, to heal the divisions of war, and to reform the corruption that had plagued Washington. His first major act fulfilled the compromise. Federal troops withdrew from Louisiana and South Carolina. The last Reconstruction governments fell, and white democratic rule known as Home Rule returned to the South. For Southern whites, it marked the end of federal interference. For African Americans, it marked the beginning of a long, dark era of disenfranchisement, segregation, and racial terror. Hayes believed his policy would ease tensions and promote unity. In truth, it left millions unprotected. Yet Hayes's presidency was not defined solely by Reconstruction's end. He also championed reform in an age of patronage and spoils. He sought to replace political favoritism with merit-based appointments. When powerful senators resisted his efforts, Hayes stood firm. Even removing the corrupt collector of the Port of New York, a man named Chester A. Arthur, a bold move that earned him enemies but proved his integrity. Hayes also confronted the challenges of a rapidly changing economy. The nation was still recovering from the Panic of 1873, which had plunged millions into unemployment. Labor unrest was spreading. In 1877, the Great Railroad Strike erupted, the first nationwide strike in American history. As rail workers protested wage cuts, violence broke out across multiple cities. Hayes faced an agonizing choice. Believing law and order must be maintained, he deployed federal troops to restore peace. The strike was crushed, leaving dozens dead and deep resentment among the working class. Critics accused him of siding with business over labor, but Hayes believed he had prevented anarchy. The event exposed the growing tensions of industrial America, a nation transforming from farms to factories, from local life to urban power. Despite political battles, Hayes brought a sense of calm and decency to the White House. He refused to use his office for personal gain. He banned liquor and card games from official functions, turning the mansion into a symbol of moral respectability. His wife, Lucy Webb Hayes, often called Lemonade Lucy, became the first college-educated First Lady and an advocate for education, temperance, and social reform. Together, they represented the ideal of virtue in an age of cynicism. Hayes was also forward-looking in matters of education and civil rights. Though he ended Reconstruction, he still believed in racial equality as a moral principle. He promoted education for black citizens, hoping learning would secure what politics could not. He also advocated for Native American assimilation through schooling and citizenship, a policy flawed in vision, but earnest in intent. In foreign affairs, Hayes pursued peace and stability. He strengthened ties with Latin America and sought fair treatment for Chinese immigrants. Though Congress overruled him with the Chinese Exclusion Act a few years after he left office. He warned against discrimination, urging Americans to remain faithful to their founding ideals, even as the nation diversified. True to his word, Hayes refused to seek re-election. He saw the presidency not as a career, but as a duty. When his single term ended in 1881, he retired quietly to his home in Fremont, Ohio. There, he devoted the rest of his life to education, prison reform, and veterans' causes. He served as trustee of several colleges and worked to improve the rights of black citizens in the South. Even out of office, his commitment to justice endured. Rutherford B. Hayes died in 1893 at the age of 70. His passing marked the end of an era. The generation that had fought to preserve the Union was fading away. Yet Hayes left behind more than laws or policies. He left an example of integrity in a time of corruption, moderation in a time of division, and faith in the moral conscience of the Republic. History remembers him as the president who ended Reconstruction. That is true, but incomplete. He was also the man who tried to reconcile principle with peace, who believed honesty was the highest form of politics, and who governed not for glory, but for conscience. Rutherford B. Hayes stood between two Americas, the one born of war and the one moving toward industry and expansion. His presidency closed one chapter and opened another as the nation stepped into the modern age. He once wrote in his diary, "He serves his party best who serves his country best." That sentence became the theme of his life. Rutherford B. Hayes, the peacemaker after the storm. The man who sought unity, even when unity required painful compromise. And the third Republican president of the United States who tried, in his quiet and steadfast way, to heal the heart of a nation still learning what freedom truly meant. James A. Garfield, 1881. The president who died for reform. It was the dawn of a new decade, and America stood at a crossroads. The wounds of the Civil War were healing. Industry was booming. And railroads stretched across the continent like veins of steel. Yet beneath the surface of progress, corruption lingered in Washington. The spoils system, where political loyalty was rewarded with government jobs, had turned the federal government into a marketplace of favors. The people wanted honesty. They wanted reform. And into that moment stepped a man of rare intellect and moral conviction, James Abram Garfield, the fourth Republican president of the United States. James Garfield was born in 1831 in a log cabin in Orange Township, Ohio. His father died when he was only 2 years old, leaving his mother, Eliza, to raise him in poverty. From the beginning, Garfield's life was a story of determination. He worked as a farmhand, a carpenter, and even a canal boat driver before earning enough to attend school. He taught himself Latin and Greek, eventually enrolling at Williams College in Massachusetts, where he excelled in every subject. Garfield's rise was built on intellect and character. He became a teacher, then a college president, and later a preacher in the Disciples of Christ Church. But it was his sense of duty that drew him into public service. When the Civil War erupted, Garfield volunteered to fight for the Union. He quickly rose through the ranks, earning distinction for his leadership and courage at the Battle of Chickamauga. By 1863, he had been elected to Congress, a soldier statesman like so many of his generation. In the House of Representatives, Garfield gained a reputation for eloquence and independence. He believed in education, civil rights, and sound government. He opposed the excesses of Reconstruction, but never abandoned its moral foundation, equality before the law. For 17 years, he served Ohio's people, respected by allies and opponents alike. By 1880, the Republican Party was divided. The old war generation, led by powerful senators and party bosses, clashed over control. Two factions had emerged: the stalwarts, who defended the spoils system and patronage, and the half-breeds, who called for reform and merit-based appointments. The Republican National Convention of 1880 was chaos. Neither Ulysses S. Grant, the stalwart favorite, nor James G. Blaine, the half-breed leader, could secure the nomination. In a moment that stunned the nation, a compromise emerged. James A. Garfield, who had come to the convention simply to nominate another man, suddenly became the nominee himself. The delegates, tired of factional fighting, turned to someone they trusted. Garfield never sought the presidency. It sought him. In November 1880, Garfield narrowly defeated Democrat Winfield Scott Hancock, a fellow Civil War general. His victory was modest in numbers, but immense in meaning. To many Americans, Garfield represented honesty, education, and progress, the self-made man who rose from poverty to the presidency through hard work and integrity. When he took office in March 1881, Kia brought a new energy to the White House. He sought to modernize government, expand education, and reform the bloated civil service. He believed that competence, not connections, should determine who served the people. It was an idea radical enough to challenge the power structure of Washington. But Garfield's noble intentions quickly collided with political reality. The stalwarts, led by the powerful Senator Roscoe Conkling of New York, demanded that Garfield reward their faction with government appointments, especially control over lucrative customs positions in New York Harbor. Garfield refused. He insisted that the presidency belonged to the nation, not to party bosses. His resistance made him enemies among those who viewed the federal government as spoils to be divided. Amid the growing feud, Garfield appointed James G. Blaine as Secretary of State and surrounded himself with men committed to reform. His administration began to lay plans for improving education, promoting civil rights in the South, and strengthening the independence of the executive branch. In his short time, Garfield inspired hope that the moral conscience of Lincoln and Grant might once again guide the Republican Party. But destiny had other plans. On the morning of July 2, 1881, just 4 months into his presidency, Garfield walked into the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station in Washington, D.C., preparing to depart for a speaking engagement. As he greeted his Secretary of State, 2 gunshots rang out. The assassin was Charles J. Guiteau, a deranged office-seeker who believed he deserved a government position and imagined divine instruction to kill the president. Garfield collapsed to the floor, struck in the back. He was carried to the White House, gravely wounded but alive. For the next 79 days, the nation held its breath. Doctors crowded around the president's bed, probing his wound with unsterilized instruments. Not knowing they were spreading infection, Garfield bore the pain with stoic courage. "I am here," he said to his wife, "and I mean to stay." News of his condition spread around the world. Americans of every class and party prayed for his recovery. Messages poured in from kings and commoners alike. Across the North and South, newspapers spoke of him not as a politician, but as a man of decency and virtue. In those long summer months, Garfield became a symbol of national unity, a reminder that even in a divided era, the office of the presidency still carried the weight of moral leadership. But the infection worsened. By September, his body weakened beyond repair. On September 19, 1881, at the Jersey Shore, where he had been moved for comfort, James A. Garfield died. He was only 49 years old. His presidency had lasted just 200 days, one of the shortest in American history. The nation mourned deeply. Bells tolled in every city. Black cloth hung from public buildings. For the first time since Lincoln, Americans wept, not for a political leader, but for a man they felt they truly knew. He had been honest, kind, and human, qualities rare in the bitter politics of the age. Garfield's death shocked the country into action. The spoils system, long defended by entrenched politicians, suddenly appeared grotesque, not merely corrupt, but deadly. Public outrage fueled a movement that would finally bring reform. 2 years later, under President Chester A. Arthur, the very man once aligned with the spoils faction, Congress passed a Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act of 1883, establishing that federal jobs would be awarded on merit, not political loyalty. It was Garfield's ultimate legacy. He had died for reform. His assassination, born of corruption and entitlement, became the catalyst for change. Beyond reform, Garfield's life story remains one of the most inspiring in American history. He was proof that in the United States, greatness could be achieved through learning, perseverance, and integrity. He rose from a one-room log cabin to the presidency through sheer intellect and moral character. He once said, "Next in importance to freedom and justice is popular education, without which neither freedom nor justice can be permanently maintained." Those words captured the essence of his vision. Garfield believed that democracy depended on an educated citizenry. That knowledge was the lifeblood of liberty. His commitment to learning shaped his entire life, from teacher to general, from congressman to president. Though his time in office was short, his impact was profound. He brought hope to a weary republic, rekindled faith in honest government, and left behind a legacy of courage and conscience. His life was a testament to the American dream that a poor boy, armed with nothing but determination and integrity, could rise to lead a nation. James A. Garfield, the scholar who became a soldier, the soldier who became a president, the president who became a martyr for reform. He entered history quietly, lived honorably, and died for the idea that government should serve the people, not the powerful. And though his time in office lasted only months, his sacrifice reshaped the nation's political soul for generations to come. Chester A. Arthur, 1881 to 1885, the gentleman president who redeemed himself. When President James A. Garfield died in the autumn of 1881, the nation grieved deeply. But along with sorrow came fear that the man now assuming the presidency was unfit, corrupt, and beholden to the very political machine that had destroyed Garfield's dream of reform. His name was Chester Alan Arthur, vice president turned accidental president. Few Americans expected greatness from him. Fewer still expected redemption. Arthur had been born in 1829 in Fairfield, Vermont, the son of a strict Baptist preacher. His father's uncompromising sermons against sin and injustice earned him the nickname Old Honesty. That same moral fire, tempered by years in politics, would later emerge in his son, but only after trial. Young Chester grew up in poverty, but ambition burned within him. He worked as a teacher, then a lawyer, moving to New York City in his 20s. There, he built a career and a reputation. He was charming, well-dressed, and sociable, a man of grace and manners in a city of ambition. But beneath that polish, he was also a skilled political operator. Arthur rose through the ranks of the Republican Party machine led by Senator Roscoe Conkling, the powerful boss of New York's stalwart faction. In those days, politics ran on patronage, jobs and favors traded for loyalty. Arthur became a loyal stalwart, serving as collector of the Port of New York, one of the most lucrative and politically charged posts in America. Thousands of appointments and millions of dollars in customs revenue flowed through his office. Though accused of corruption, Arthur himself was never found guilty of wrongdoing. He defended the spoils system as tradition, a way to reward party service. Still, reformers despised him. When President Rutherford B. Hayes removed him from the post in 1878 to fight corruption, Arthur accepted his dismissal, but not defeat. Then came the election of 1880, to balance the Republican ticket and unite the feuding stalwart and half-breed factions. The convention nominated James A. Garfield for president, and, to the shock of reformers, Chester A. Arthur as his running mate. The choice was political compromise, nothing more. Arthur was expected to bring party loyalty, not leadership. When Garfield was shot just 4 months into his presidency, the country trembled. The assassin, Charles Guiteau, had shouted, "I am a stalwart, and Arthur is president now." That cry turned public suspicion into fury. Many Americans believed that Arthur, the creature of the machine, would now reward corruption and destroy reform. For weeks, Arthur stayed in seclusion, stricken by guilt and fear. He had not plotted Garfield's death, but he bore its political shadow. When Garfield finally died in September 1881, Arthur took the oath of office in his New York home at midnight. He wept openly as he swore to preserve the Constitution. To nearly everyone, he seemed an unworthy heir. But in that moment, something changed in Chester A. Arthur. The death of Garfield became a mirror, forcing him to confront the kind of man and leader he truly wished to be. As president, Arthur surprised the nation. Gone was the party loyalist who bowed to bosses. In his place stood a quiet, dignified statesman who believed the office demanded honor above all else. Arthur brought elegance and discipline to the White House. He ordered it refurbished, transforming the worn mansion into a place of beauty. Tiffany stained glass, fine art, and ornate furnishings replaced the drab interiors of earlier administrations. But the changes went deeper than decoration. Arthur also began cleaning house politically. He refused to hand out patronage positions, earning the wrath of his old allies. Most dramatically, he embraced the cause that Garfield had died for, civil service reform. In 1883, Arthur signed the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, establishing that federal jobs would be awarded based on merit, not political favor. It created the Civil Service Commission and began the long process of dismantling the spoils system that had dominated American politics since Andrew Jackson's time. It was a stunning act of principle. Reformers were astonished. Party bosses were outraged. Roscoe Conkling, Arthur's old mentor, turned against him. Yet Arthur stood firm, declaring that the government must serve all people, not merely a party. In doing so, he redeemed his name and gave his presidency lasting purpose. Arthur's administration also saw progress in modernization. He invested in rebuilding the U.S. Navy, which had fallen into decay after the Civil War. He approved new steel warships, laying the foundation for the new Navy that would one day make America a global power. He reformed the system of tariffs, encouraged commerce, and strengthened the nation's finances. But not all was triumph. Arthur's presidency faced difficult moral choices, especially over immigration and race. When Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, the first major law to restrict immigration by nationality, Arthur vetoed it on grounds of fairness and diplomacy. But after Congress revised and repassed the bill, he reluctantly signed it into law. It was a dark compromise, one that reflected the rising racial tensions of a changing nation. Arthur also struggled to improve the condition of Native Americans, advocating for education and assimilation, but failing to stop the erosion of their lands. His reforms were well-intended, but limited by the biases of the era. In foreign policy, Arthur's presidency was steady and pragmatic. He strengthened relations with Latin America and sought new trade opportunities. He also enforced laws against polygamy in Utah and corruption in federal offices across the country. He was no visionary, but he was a guardian preserving order, integrity, and respect for law during a time of cynicism. Privately, Arthur faced another trial, one far more personal. In 1880, before taking office, his beloved wife, Ellen, had died suddenly of pneumonia. Her loss haunted him. As president, he often visited her grave late at night, alone, placing fresh flowers on the marble stone. Her absence softened him, deepened his empathy, and perhaps made him more reflective about power and mortality. By 1884, when the time came for another election, Arthur's health was failing. He suffered from Bright's disease, a fatal kidney disorder he kept secret from the public. Despite his achievements, his own party turned against him, denying him the Republican nomination. He accepted it calmly, saying simply, "The office of the presidency is not a place to reward ambition." Chester A. Arthur left the White House in March 1885, dignified and silent. He returned to New York, his health worsening but his reputation reborn. Key died the following year at the age of 57. In death, as in life, Arthur remained an enigma, a man underestimated by history, yet transformed by the weight of responsibility. He entered the presidency as a symbol of corruption and left it as a symbol of honor. Even his fiercest critics admitted he had become something rare, a politician who put country above party, character above convenience. One journalist wrote of him, "No man ever entered the presidency so profoundly and widely distrusted, and no one ever retired from it more generally respected." Chester Alan Arthur proved that redemption is possible, even in politics. He showed that power can refine as well as corrupt, and that leadership sometimes arises not from ambition, but from awakening. He was the dapper president, the unexpected reformer, the guardian of Garfield's legacy, the man who transformed tragedy into integrity. Chester A. Arthur, the gentleman president, the fifth Republican to hold the nation's highest office, the man who restored faith to a cynical age, not by speeches or battles, but by the quiet courage to change himself and, through that change, to serve his country with honor. The forgotten president of the Gilded Age. The year was 1889. America was booming, louder, faster, and brighter than ever before. The clang of factories, the thunder of locomotives, and the glow of electric lights filled its cities. Wealth was rising, but so were worries. Behind the glitter of progress, the so-called Gilded Age, lay poverty, corruption, and unrest. The people wanted prosperity, but also fairness. They wanted growth, but not greed. Into this restless new America stepped a quiet, disciplined man, Benjamin Harrison, the 23rd President of the United States, and the 6th from the Republican Party. Benjamin Harrison was born in 1833 in North Bend, Ohio, into a family already etched into American history. His grandfather, William Henry Harrison, had served briefly as the nation's 9th president before dying just a month into his term. His father, John Scott Harrison, had also served in Congress. Public service, it seemed, ran in the family's blood. But Benjamin Harrison was no heir to privilege. He was raised modestly, educated at Miami University in Ohio, and built his life on hard work and integrity. A small man in stature, only 5 feet 6 inches tall, he carried himself with a soldier's discipline and a lawyer's precision. He spoke with calm authority, never seeking applause but earning respect. When the Civil War began, Harrison enlisted as a volunteer in the Union Army. He rose to the rank of brigadier general, earning the nickname Little Ben from his troops. His courage in battle, his quiet confidence, and his commitment to duty marked him as a man of substance. After the war, he returned to Indiana, built a successful law practice, and entered Republican politics. By the 1880s, Harrison had become one of the Midwest's leading voices, conservative in principle, yet progressive in vision. He believed in a strong union, fair elections, and the moral responsibility of government. In 1888, when the Republicans sought a candidate to challenge Democrat Grover Cleveland, they turned to Harrison, a man of reputation, faith, and military honor. The election of 1888 was one of the most controversial of its age. Harrison lost the popular vote to Cleveland, but won the Electoral College, securing the presidency through narrow victories in key northern states. He entered office under criticism from Democrats and skepticism from ordinary citizens. But what followed would be one of the most active and ambitious presidencies of the late 19th century. From the start, Harrison governed with precision and energy. He was methodical, organized, and deeply principled. Some said, too much so. He saw the presidency not as a stage for performance, but as a workshop for policy. His administration worked tirelessly to modernize the nation's finances, protect American industry, and assert the country's place on the world stage. The most defining legislation of his term was the McKinley Tariff of 1890, named after Congressman William McKinley, a rising Republican star. It raised import duties to protect American manufacturers from foreign competition. Harrison believed that high tariffs would strengthen national industry and create good jobs for American workers. But the law also made consumer goods more expensive, and it angered farmers and working families already struggling under economic pressure. Alongside the tariff came another landmark act, one that would echo through the next century. In 1890, Harrison signed the Sherman Antitrust Act, the first federal law to prohibit monopolies and corporate combinations that restrained trade. It was a bold step against the unchecked power of industrial giants, the Rockefellers, Carnegies, and Morgans, who dominated the Gilded Age economy. Though weakly enforced at first, it set the foundation for the government's later battles against monopoly and corporate abuse. Harrison also oversaw a surge in national growth. During his presidency, 6 new states entered the Union: North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, and Wyoming, more than under any president since George Washington. The map of America stretched westward, its destiny manifest and unstoppable. His administration also championed veterans' rights, a cause close to his heart as a Civil War officer. He expanded pensions for Union veterans and their families, arguing that those who had preserved the nation deserved its gratitude. Critics accused him of bloating the budget, but Harrison saw it as a moral duty. He once said, "When we make appropriations for soldiers, we are paying a debt we owe." Yet his presidency was not all triumph. The federal budget, swollen by tariffs and pensions, reached unprecedented levels. The press called it the billion-dollar Congress, for ordinary Americans struggling to make ends meet. The title sounded like mockery. Harrison also faced growing labor unrest as workers protested poor conditions and low wages in the nation's rapidly industrializing cities. Strikes turned violent. Tensions rose between labor and capital, The Republican Party, once the party of Lincoln's freedom and Grant's justice, now seemed tied to big business and the wealthy elite. Still, Benjamin Harrison stood firm in his principles. He believed deeply in law, order, and the power of institutions to serve the common good. He pushed for federal protection of voting rights in the South, an ambitious attempt to defend the civil rights of Black Americans, which had been eroded after Reconstruction. The proposal, known as the Federal Elections Bill, failed in the Senate, blocked by Southern Democrats and Northern conservatives. Yet its spirit would live on in future civil rights battles. In foreign policy, Harrison's presidency marked the beginning of a more assertive American presence in the world. He expanded the U.S. Navy, continuing the modernization begun under Chester Arthur, and pursued new trade agreements with Latin American nations. Under his watch, the first Pan-American Conference was held in 1889, laying groundwork for cooperation between the United States and its southern neighbors. He also took a firm stance in the Pacific, advancing American interests in Hawaii and Samoa, setting the stage for future expansion. For the first time since the Civil War, the United States began to look outward, toward the oceans and beyond. Behind the stern public image, Benjamin Harrison was a man of deep faith and personal sorrow. His wife, Caroline Lavinia Harrison, served as First Lady with grace and intelligence. She oversaw the installation of electricity in the White House and promoted education and women's causes. But near the end of Harrison's term, she fell gravely ill with tuberculosis. Her death in 1892 devastated the president, draining him of energy as he faced re-election. In November 1892, Benjamin Harrison ran once more against Grover Cleveland and lost. The people, weary of economic strain and high tariffs, chose the Democrat they had rejected for years before. Harrison left office quietly, returning to private life in Indianapolis. He resumed his law practice, wrote and lectured, finding peace in family and faith. He remarried in 1896 to Mary Scott Lord Dimmock, his late wife's niece, a union that stirred controversy but brought him companionship in his final years. He died in 1901, just as the new century was beginning, overshadowed by louder presidents and larger events. History has often called Benjamin Harrison a forgotten president. He served between two more famous men, Cleveland before him and after him, and in an age dominated by titans of industry and rapid change, his quiet dignity was easy to overlook. Yet his legacy endures in law, in reform, and in principle. He strengthened the presidency as an instrument of policy, not personality. He defended the integrity of the vote, advanced civil rights, and set the foundation for America's modern economic and foreign policy systems. Benjamin Harrison once said, "The bud of victory is always in the truth." He governed by that belief that honest purpose, not popularity, is the measure of leadership. He was a man of duty, intellect, and faith, a president who stood firm in the storm of the Gilded Age. Benjamin Harrison, the statesman between two centuries, the lawyer who became a general, the general who became a reformer, and the reformer who became a president. The sixth Republican president of the United States, who guided America through the glitter and shadows of industrial power and left behind a legacy of order, law, and quiet honor. William McKinley, 1897 to 1901, the president who led America into the modern world. At the dawn of the 20th century, the United States stood transformed. Railroads stretched from ocean to ocean. Steel towers rose above bustling cities. Electric light turned night into day. The Civil War generation had faded, and a new America, industrial, confident, and ambitious, had taken its place. In this age of invention and expansion, a new Republican leader emerged, calm, steady, and optimistic. His name was William McKinley, the 25th President of the United States and the 7th to carry the banner of the Republican Party. He would guide the nation from the quiet prosperity of the Gilded Age into the restless power of the modern world. William McKinley was born in 1843 in Niles, Ohio, the seventh of 9 children in a modest family. He grew up in a small town where hard work and faith were the measure of character. When the Civil War broke out, McKinley was just 18. He enlisted as a private in the Union Army and served under the command of Rutherford B. Hayes, a man who would one day become president himself. McKinley proved brave and dependable, earning promotions through merit alone. At Antietam, he brought food and ammunition to the front lines under heavy fire, an act of courage that made a lasting impression. By the war's end, he had risen to the rank of major, a title he would proudly carry for the rest of his life. After the war, McKinley studied law, entered politics, and joined the rising generation of Republican leaders who blended patriotism with progress. He was a man of quiet discipline and unwavering faith in the promise of America. His deep voice, gentle manner, and ability to listen made him a natural leader in a turbulent age. Elected to Congress in 1876, McKinley became one of the Republican Party's leading advocates for protective tariffs, the idea that shielding American industries from foreign competition would strengthen the national economy. His belief in economic nationalism earned him both admiration and opposition. To workers, he promised jobs and prosperity. To industrialists, he promised growth and stability. After serving as governor of Ohio, McKinley was nominated for president in 1896, at a moment when the nation teetered on economic despair. The Panic of 1893 had thrown millions out of work. Banks failed, farmers lost their land. Populist and Democratic candidate William Jennings Bryan electrified crowds with his Cross of Gold speech, demanding free silver and inflation to lift the poor from debt. McKinley's message was calmer but just as powerful. The man who is worthy to be trusted with the property of others is worthy to be trusted with his own. He stood for sound money, stable government, and prosperity through industry and trade. Backed by businessman Mark Hanna, McKinley ran one of the first modern political campaigns, organized, financed, and disciplined. He promised a full dinner pail to working Americans, a symbol of steady wages and security. When the votes were counted, McKinley won decisively, restoring Republican control of the White House and ushering in a new era of confidence. Taking office in 1897, President McKinley faced a nation divided by class, but united in hope. His quiet strength calmed the turbulence of the 1890s. He quickly passed the Dingley Tariff, one of the highest in history, to protect American manufacturers. He restored trust in the economy and revived faith in government after years of uncertainty. Under McKinley, America's industrial power exploded. Steel production soared, railroads expanded, and the United States became the world's leading exporter. For the first time, America looked outward, not just to survive, but to lead. That opportunity came swiftly in the waters of the Caribbean. For decades, the island of Cuba had struggled under Spanish colonial rule. By the late 1890s, rebellion flared again, and American newspapers, eager for sensational headlines, filled their pages with stories of Spanish atrocities. The cry went up across the nation, "Cuba Libre, free Cuba." McKinley hesitated. He had fought in war and knew its cost. He sought negotiation first, urging Spain to grant Cuba autonomy. But then, in February 1898, the American battleship USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, killing 266 sailors. The cause was uncertain, but the press blamed Spain. "Remember the Maine" became a national rallying cry. Despite his natural caution, McKinley could not resist public pressure. On April 25, 1898, Congress declared war. The Spanish-American War had begun a conflict that would last only for months, but changed the nation forever. The war was swift and decisive. American forces crushed Spain in both the Caribbean and the Pacific. In Cuba, future President Theodore Roosevelt led his Rough Riders up San Juan Hill to fame. In Manila Bay, Admiral George Dewey destroyed the Spanish fleet in a single morning, announcing America's arrival as a global naval power. By August, Spain had surrendered. The Treaty of Paris, signed later that year, brought vast new territories under American control: Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Cuba was freed, though temporarily occupied by U.S. forces. For the first time, the United States possessed overseas colonies. The war marked the birth of the American empire, a shift from isolation to intervention, from continental power to world power. McKinley, once reluctant, now faced a new challenge: what to do with America's newfound dominion. Some, like Mark Twain and William Jennings Bryan, condemned imperialism as betrayal of American ideals, but McKinley defended it as duty. "We could not leave the Philippines to themselves," he said. "There was nothing left for us to do but to educate the Filipinos, uplift, and Christianize them." To modern ears, his words carry the tone of empire, the paternalism of the age. Yet to McKinley, it was an act of faith. He believed America had been chosen to guide the world toward liberty and order, though not all would share that vision. At home, McKinley's steady leadership and booming economy made him immensely popular. The gold standard, secured by the Gold Standard Act of 1900, stabilized the currency. Prosperity returned. Wages rose. Cities flourished. The once struggling nation entered a golden period of growth and optimism. But even as progress surged, shadows lingered. The new industrial order widened the gap between rich and poor. Labor strikes erupted in steel mills and coal mines. And in the Philippines, a bitter insurgency flared as independence fighters turned against their new rulers. The United States found itself fighting a guerrilla war it had never expected: the price of empire. In 1900, McKinley was easily re-elected. This time with a dynamic young running mate, Theodore Roosevelt, the hero of San Juan Hill. The ticket symbolized a bridge between generations: McKinley's calm conservatism and Roosevelt's rising energy. Together, they embodied the Republican vision of prosperity and progress. But destiny intervened once more. On September 6, 1901, while attending the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, McKinley stood in a receiving line greeting citizens. A young anarchist named Leon Czolgosz approached him, concealing a revolver beneath a handkerchief. At point-blank range, he fired 2 shots into the president's abdomen. McKinley staggered but remained calm, saying softly, "Let no one hurt him." He was rushed for treatment, and for days it seemed he might recover. But infection set in. On September 14, 1901, William McKinley died, the third American president to be assassinated in 40 years. The nation plunged into mourning. Tens of thousands came to pay their respects as his body lay in state. From factory workers to business leaders, from veterans to schoolchildren. All felt they had lost not just a president, but a friend, a man who had led them with dignity and faith through an age of upheaval. With McKinley's death, the old century ended. The mantle of leadership passed to Theodore Roosevelt, and with him, a new America was born, energetic, global, and modern. Yet McKinley's legacy endured. He had guided the United States from the uncertainty of the 19th century into the promise of the 20th. He restored prosperity, built confidence, and laid the foundations of America's world power. He believed that kindness and strength could coexist. That progress required both moral clarity and practical wisdom. His presidency marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. From the world of Lincoln to the world of Roosevelt. From a republic of states to a nation of power. William McKinley, the major from Ohio, the industrial president. The man who fought a short war that reshaped the world and ushered America into the modern age. He was steady when others shouted, patient when others panicked, and faithful when others doubted. And though his life ended in violence, his vision endured that prosperity, guided by principle, could unite a nation and illuminate the world. Theodore Roosevelt, 1901 to 1909, the progressive president who made America roar when William McKinley fell to an assassin's bullet in 1901. The United States mourned deeply. But out of tragedy came transformation. A new leader, young, bold, and unafraid, stepped into the Oval Office. determined to shape the 20th century with his own hands. His name was Theodore Roosevelt, and at 42 years old, he became the youngest president in American history. He entered the White House not by election, but by fate. Yet few men were ever more ready for the burden of power. Roosevelt was born in 1858 into a wealthy New York family, a world of privilege, but also of weakness. As a boy, he was sickly, frail, and asthmatic. While other children played, he struggled for breath. But young Theodore refused to surrender. He built his body through sheer will, boxing, hiking, and horseback riding until strength became his shield. He once wrote, "Do what you can, with what you have, where you are." That creed guided him all his life. He graduated from Harvard, studied law, and entered politics with relentless energy. Yet tragedy struck early on Valentine's Day, 1884. His mother and his young wife both died on the same day, in the same house. Roosevelt's grief was unimaginable. He left New York behind and fled to the Badlands of North Dakota, where he lived among cowboys and ranchers. Learning the values of hard work, grit, and renewal, there he found himself. When he returned east, Roosevelt was no longer the delicate boy from Manhattan. He was the embodiment of the frontier spirit. He rose through the Republican Party, became New York's police commissioner, and then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, where he urged a modern naval buildup. When war came against Spain in 1898, he resigned his post and volunteered for battle, forming the Rough Riders, a cavalry regiment of adventurers, cowboys, and Ivy League athletes. His charge up San Juan Hill made him a national hero. By 1900, he was McKinley's running mate, chosen for his popularity and vigor. And when McKinley was killed the next year, Roosevelt inherited not only the presidency, but a rapidly changing nation. The America he led was bursting with energy. Factories smoking, cities swelling, railroads crisscrossing the continent. Yet behind the glory of progress lay inequality, corruption, and injustice. The Trust's vast corporations like Standard Oil and U.S. Steel dominated entire industries. Workers toiled in dangerous conditions for meager pay. Children labored in factories. And the natural wilderness that had once defined the American spirit was vanishing under the march of industrial expansion. Roosevelt saw it all, and he refused to be a bystander. He called his vision the Square Deal: fairness for workers, consumers, and businesses alike. He believed that government had a moral duty to act as the steward of the nation, to balance wealth with justice, power with responsibility. In 1902, he faced his first great test, a massive coal strike that threatened to freeze the nation. Rather than siding automatically with the mine owners, as presidents before him had done, Roosevelt summoned both sides to the White House and forced a compromise. For the first time, a president had intervened in a labor dispute not to crush the workers, but to ensure fairness. It was a revolution in the presidency, government as an active force for moral order. Then came the trusts. Roosevelt became known as the trust buster, though he preferred to be called the trust regulator. He believed that big business was necessary, but it must be held accountable. Under his administration, the Sherman Antitrust Act, first signed under Benjamin Harrison, was finally enforced. The powerful Northern Securities Company, a railroad monopoly controlled by J.P. Morgan, was broken apart by the Supreme Court at Roosevelt's urging. His message was clear: no man, however wealthy, was above the law. Roosevelt's sense of duty extended beyond economics. He was the first president to truly understand that the natural beauty of the American land was not infinite. He saw forests clear-cut, rivers polluted, and wildlife vanishing. To him, conservation was not sentiment, it was survival. He once said, "The nation behaves well if it treats the natural resources as assets which it must turn over to the next generation increased and not impaired in value." Under his leadership, more than 230 million acres of land were preserved as national parks, forests, and wildlife refuges. He created the U.S. Forest Service, established 5 national parks, and declared 18 national monuments. the Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, Yosemite. These were not just wonders of nature, but symbols of the American soul, protected for all time because Roosevelt willed it so. He also believed in preparing the nation for the future, not through isolation, but through strength. "Speak softly and carry a big stick," he said, "and you will go far." In foreign policy, that big stick defined his presidency. He oversaw the construction of the Panama Canal, one of the greatest engineering feats in history, connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans and transforming global trade. To secure its building, Roosevelt backed Panama's independence from Colombia, a move that revealed his willingness to use power boldly when he believed history demanded it. He also declared the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, asserting that the United States had the right to intervene in Latin American affairs to maintain stability and prevent European interference. It was a policy of both protection and control, one that made America the dominant force in the Western Hemisphere. Beyond the Americas, Roosevelt helped mediate peace in the Russo-Japanese War, for which he received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906, the first American to do so. He saw himself as a moral actor on the world stage, wielding power not for conquest, but for what he believed was civilization's progress. At home, Roosevelt expanded the reach of the presidency more than any man since Lincoln. He transformed it from a passive office into a platform of national leadership, the voice and conscience of the people. Reporters adored him. The public admired him. Children collected his images on trading cards. He was the first modern president, energetic, visible, and unashamed to command attention. But Roosevelt's energy also stirred controversy. Conservatives in his own party accused him of going too far, of meddling in business, of threatening the foundations of capitalism. Progressives, meanwhile, wanted him to go even further. Yet Roosevelt stood firm. "I stand for the square deal," he said. "Not the big man against the little man, but every man against injustice." As his second term ended in 1909, Roosevelt could have sought more power and likely would have won it. But he chose instead to honor the two-term tradition. "There is nothing left for me," he said, "but to go out and shoot lions." He handed the presidency to his chosen successor, William Howard Taft, and embarked on a year-long safari across Africa, hunting, exploring, and writing. The world watched in fascination as the most vigorous man in America vanished into the wilderness he loved. But retirement could not contain him. He would later return to politics, challenging Taft and splitting the Republican Party in 1912, his new progressive bull moose. Party would lose the election, but change American politics forever. Yet that is another story, one that begins with the man he had already become, the president who turned reform into action, conservation into law, and vision into legacy. When Theodore Roosevelt left the White House, the presidency itself was forever different. No longer a quiet office of administration, it had become the beating heart of American democracy, bold, visible, and moral. He once said, "Far better it is to dare mighty things, to win glorious triumphs, even though checkered by failure, than to rank with those timid souls who neither enjoy much nor suffer much." He lived and governed by those words. Theodore Roosevelt, the Rough Rider, the reformer, the conservationist, the builder of empires and protector of the land. He was the 8th Republican President of the United States, and the man who made the presidency roar with life. Because of him, America entered the 20th century not as a timid republic, but as a confident world power, fierce in spirit, rooted in justice, and forever restless in pursuit of greatness. William Howard Taft, 1909 to 1913. The reluctant president and the judge who found his place when Theodore Roosevelt left the White House in 1909. He was still the most powerful man in America, adored by the people, respected by the world, and unmatched in energy. His chosen successor, William Howard Taft, seemed the natural heir, loyal, honest, capable, and steady. Roosevelt believed Taft would carry forward his progressive legacy, ensuring the square deal lived on. But history would write a different story, one of friendship turned rivalry, reform turned caution, and a presidency remembered not for its thunder, but for its weight. William Howard Taft was born in 1857 in Cincinnati, Ohio, the son of a respected judge and cabinet member. Law and public service were part of his inheritance. From his youth, he was brilliant and disciplined, excelling at Yale University before earning his law degree. Yet even as a young man, his dream was not the presidency. It was the Supreme Court. He wanted not to rule over men, but to interpret the law that governed them. Taft's rise was steady, not sensational. He served as a judge, then as Solicitor General of the United States, and later as a federal circuit court judge. His reputation was for fairness, logic, and calm temperament. T was large in both body and heart, gentle in manner, slow to anger, and allergic to political drama. Where Roosevelt was fire, Taft was gravity. When President McKinley appointed him to oversee the Philippine Islands after the Spanish-American War, Taft proved a compassionate administrator. He treated the Filipinos not as conquered subjects, but as people to be guided toward self-government. His patience and humanity won him respect across the Pacific and the deep admiration of Theodore Roosevelt. It was Roosevelt who persuaded him to join his cabinet as Secretary of War and later to run for the presidency itself. Taft resisted, preferring the life of the judge, but Roosevelt insisted. "You are the only man I can trust to carry out my policies," he told him. Reluctantly, Taft agreed. The election of 1908 was a Republican victory. Taft defeated Democrat William Jennings Bryan, winning easily on Roosevelt's popularity. Yet from the moment he took office, it was clear that the two men were not the same. Taft was cautious, deliberate, and legalistic. He believed the president should enforce the law, not expand it. He once said, "The president cannot exercise power which cannot fairly and reasonably be traced to some specific grant of it in the Constitution." To Roosevelt, this sounded timid. To Taft, it was integrity. In his first years, Taft continued some of Roosevelt's reforms, though without fanfare. He actually brought more antitrust suits than Roosevelt had, breaking up giants like Standard Oil and the American Tobacco Company. He established the Department of Labor and supported the 16th Amendment, paving the way for the federal income tax. He also strengthened the Interstate Commerce Commission, increasing federal oversight of the railroads. But Taft lacked Roosevelt's gift for inspiration. Where Roosevelt had led with passion, Taft led with paperwork. He disliked publicity, avoided confrontation, and trusted Congress to act in good faith. The energy of the progressive era began to cool. Then came the Payne-Aldrich Tariff Act, a political disaster that would define his presidency. Taft had promised tariff reform to lower prices for consumers. But under pressure from conservative Republicans in Congress, the bill ended up maintaining high rates. When Taft defended it as the best bill ever passed, progressives felt betrayed. The rift between the party's reformers and its conservatives widened, and Roosevelt, watching from afar, began to question his friend's leadership. As the split deepened, Taft alienated another Roosevelt ally, Gifford Pinchot, the nation's top conservationist. When Taft dismissed Pinchot over a dispute involving public lands, Roosevelt saw it as proof that his beloved conservation movement was being dismantled. By 1910, Roosevelt's patience snapped. He returned from Africa, where he had gone on safari, to find his party divided and his reforms stalled. Feeling that Taft had abandoned his vision, Roosevelt declared his intent to re-enter politics. The two men, once the closest of allies, now stood on opposite sides of a moral and political divide. In 1912, Roosevelt challenged Taft for the Republican nomination. The campaign turned bitter, personal, and historic. At the convention, party leaders loyal to Taft secured the nomination, infuriating Roosevelt's supporters. Refusing to yield, Roosevelt broke away and formed the Progressive Party, declaring, "We stand at Armageddon, and we battle for the Lord." The Republican Party was shattered. In the general election, the split-handed victory to Democrat Woodrow Wilson, who won easily while Taft and Roosevelt divided the conservative and progressive votes. It was a humiliating defeat for Taft, one he bore with quiet dignity. Afterward, he admitted, "I love the law. I love the peace, the calm of the judicial atmosphere." And so, when his presidency ended in 1913, he gladly left politics behind. For the first time in years, he was free to pursue the role he had always wanted. And in 1921, that dream came true. President Warren G. Harding appointed him Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, the only man in American history to serve both as President and Chief Justice. In that position, Taft found his true calling. He brought efficiency and reform to the federal judiciary, oversaw the construction of the Supreme Court building in Washington, and restored dignity to a branch of government he believed was the true guardian of liberty. Taft's years on the court were marked by calm and purpose, the life of reason he had long sought. He once said, "Presidents come and go, but the Supreme Court goes on forever." For him, this was not resignation, it was fulfillment. William Howard Taft died in 1930, honored not for his politics, but for his principles. His grave rests in Arlington National Cemetery, beside the soldiers he once commanded as Secretary of War, the first president ever buried there. History has not always been kind to him. It's overshadowed by the legend of Roosevelt and the turmoil of his era. Taft is often remembered as indecisive, slow, or complacent. In truth, he was a man of deep integrity, a conservative in the truest sense, believing that progress must be built on law, not impulse. He did not seek greatness, but he achieved dignity. He did not crave power, but he earned respect. And though his presidency divided the Republican Party, his service to the Constitution united his legacy. In an age of noise, Taft was quiet. In an age of ambition, he was content. And in an age of reform, he reminded America that justice is the surest form of progress. William Howard Taft, the reluctant president, the loyal friend turned rival, the judge who found his place. He was the 9th Republican President of the United States, the man who bridged the energy of Roosevelt and the stability of law, and who proved that even in politics, honor can be its own kind of greatness. The promise of normalcy and the shadow of scandal. The year was 1920. The Great War had ended, but the peace was uneasy. Europe lay in ruins, revolutions brewed abroad, and at home, the United States was weary of sacrifice, of idealism, of Woodrow Wilson's crusade to make the world safe for democracy. The American people longed for something simpler: peace, prosperity, and predictability. Into that longing stepped a man with a calm voice, a reassuring smile, and a single phrase that captured the mood of a nation: return to normalcy. His name was Warren Gamaliel Harding, the 10th Republican President of the United States. Harding was born in 1865 in a small farmhouse near Blooming Grove, Ohio, the first president born after the Civil War. His upbringing was modest but comfortable, shaped by the rhythm of rural life and the values of family and faith. He grew up working in his father's printing shop, where he learned the power of words, how ink on paper could move hearts and shape opinion. As a young man, Harding entered journalism. He founded and edited the Marion Star, a small-town newspaper that became his platform and his pride. Through its pages, he spoke with warmth and common sense about the everyday struggles of his neighbors. He was not a crusader or a philosopher. He was a listener, a man who reflected the feelings of ordinary Americans. His easy charm and deep radio-quality voice carried him into politics. By the early 1900s, Harding had become a state senator, then lieutenant governor, and later a U.S. senator from Ohio. He was handsome, friendly, and approachable, the kind of man who made others feel at ease. Even his critics admitted that he looked like a president. But Harding himself never seemed driven by ambition. He once said, "I am not fit for this office and should never have been here. Yet, in 1920, after a deadlocked Republican convention, he emerged as a compromise candidate, a safe, genial choice after the exhaustion of war and reform. He ran against Democrat James M. Cox, with Franklin D. Roosevelt as Cox's running mate. Harding's message was simple and soothing. America needed rest, not revolution; comfort, not crusade. He promised less government in business and more business in government. The country embraced his words. In one of the most decisive victories in U.S. history, Harding won over 60% of the popular vote and carried every region outside the Deep South. His triumph signaled the return of Republican dominance and the beginning of the Roaring Twenties. When Harding took office in March 1921, he inherited a nation weary but ready to rebuild. The economy was struggling through post-war recession, but confidence soon returned. Factories reopened, wages rose, and consumer goods, radios, cars, and household appliances poured into American homes. For the first time, ordinary families could dream not just of survival, but of comfort. Harding surrounded himself with a mix of capable professionals and political allies, a combination that would prove both his strength and his undoing. Among the able were Charles Evans Hughes as Secretary of State, Herbert Hoover as Secretary of Commerce, and Andrew Mellon, the powerful financier who became Secretary of the Treasury. Together, they pursued policies that defined the decade: tax cuts, reduced federal spending, and a return to economic conservatism. Mellon's tax reforms slashed rates for businesses and individuals alike, arguing that prosperity would trickle down through investment and job creation. Harding also signed the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921, which established the first federal budget process and created the Bureau of the Budget, a landmark step toward modern fiscal management. Under Harding's watch, the economy recovered rapidly. By 1922, unemployment had fallen, industry was booming, and Wall Street was surging. America had indeed returned to normalcy, at least on the surface. But beneath that calm exterior, cracks were forming. Harding was a man of deep personal decency but weak discipline. He trusted too easily, delegated too freely, and surrounded himself with men whose loyalty exceeded their honesty. Some of his closest friends, known collectively as the Ohio Gang, abused their access to power for personal gain. While Harding toured the nation and hosted poker nights in the White House, his associates were quietly enriching themselves through bribery and corruption. The most infamous of these scandals would emerge after his death, the Teapot Dome Affair, in which Secretary of the Interior Albert Befall secretly leased federal oil reserves to private companies in exchange for money and gifts. It would become one of the greatest political scandals in American history. Despite the corruption brewing in his administration, Harding's presidency was not without achievement. He signed treaties that limited naval armaments, helping ease tensions after World War I. The Washington Naval Conference of 1921-22 brought together the world's great powers, the United States, Britain, Japan, France, and Italy, to prevent an arms race and preserve peace in the Pacific. It was one of the earliest examples of multilateral diplomacy and a testament to Harding's quiet desire for stability. He also supported civil rights, an unusual stance for his time. Speaking in Alabama in 1921, he declared that Black Americans should have full political equality, words that shocked Southern audiences. Though his administration made little progress on that front, his willingness to speak those words at all marked a rare moment of courage in an age of silence. In July 1923, while traveling through the West Coast, Harding fell ill. In San Francisco, on the evening of August 2nd, he died suddenly of a heart attack at the age of 57. The nation was stunned. For all his flaws, Harding had been loved, a genial, humble man whose warmth had touched millions. When his body returned to Washington, thousands lined the streets to pay their respects. His casket lay in state beneath the Capitol dome, guarded by soldiers from the war he had promised to leave behind. But in the months that followed, As the investigations deepened, the truth emerged. The scandals of his administration, Teapot, Dome, Veterans Bureau, fraud, and other schemes cast a long shadow over his memory. What had begun as an era of optimism ended in disillusionment. Warren Harding's name became synonymous with corruption, an irony for a man who, by all accounts, was personally honest, if tragically trusting. His heart was kind, but his judgment was flawed. History has struggled to define him. Was he a failure, or simply a decent man overwhelmed by the forces around him? Perhaps both. He once said, "I am not fit for this office and should never have been here." In those words lies his truth. Harding's presidency was not one of malice, but of mismanagement. Not of villainy, but of vulnerability. Yet, even in failure, his leadership reflected the soul of his time, a nation tired of war and idealism, yearning for rest, prosperity, and normal life. For a brief moment, he gave them that peace. Warren G. Harding, the man who promised normalcy, the man who trusted too much, the man whose warmth brought calm to a weary nation and whose weakness unleashed its darker side. He was the 10th Republican President of the United States, a symbol of the Roaring Twenties promise and peril, of a people racing toward modernity while still haunted by the shadows of power and greed. And in the quiet after his passing, America learned once again the hardest truth of all, that even in the pursuit of normalcy, history never stands still. The silent president of the Roaring Twenties when Warren G. Harding died suddenly in the summer of 1923, the nation's confidence trembled once more. Rumors of corruption swirled around Washington, and the public's trust in government had nearly evaporated. In the stillness of a small Vermont farmhouse, far from the noise of the capital, a man was awakened in the night with urgent news. By the light of a kerosene lamp, his father, a notary public, administered the oath of office. The man who now became President of the United States was quiet, disciplined, and incorruptible. His name was Calvin Coolidge, a man of few words but of steady purpose. Coolidge's rise was as unlikely as it was emblematic of the American story. Born in 1872 in the rural hills of Vermont, he was the son of a farmer, raised among simple people and simple values: thrift, honesty, hard work. He never sought fame, never chased power, but duty seemed always to find him. After studying law in Massachusetts, he entered politics through quiet persistence rather than ambition. He served as mayor, state legislator, and lieutenant governor before becoming governor of Massachusetts. His moment of national fame came in 1919 during the Boston police strike, when law enforcement officers walked off the job, leaving the city in chaos. Coolidge refused to yield to the strikers, declaring, "There is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime." His words electrified the country. To many Americans, Coolidge represented law, order, and moral backbone at a time of unrest. When he became vice president under Harding, he kept to himself, respectful, unobtrusive, and reserved. Few imagined that this quiet Yankee would soon inherit the highest office in the land. But in August 1923, as Harding's scandals erupted and the president suddenly died, Coolidge ascended to power. His calm manner, his integrity, and his austere lifestyle reassured the people. America, he believed, did not need drama. It needed stability. As he took command, the economy was booming. Factories hummed. Radios crackled with jazz and baseball broadcasts. The nation had automobiles, airplanes, and an expanding middle class. In this age of abundance, Coolidge became the perfect symbol of the times: restrained amid extravagance, silent amid noise. He believed deeply in limited government, that prosperity came not from laws, but from liberty. "The business of America," he famously said, "is business." To him, government's role was to maintain order, balance the budget, and then step aside. Coolidge cut federal spending to levels unseen since before World War I. He reduced the national debt by more than a third and slashed taxes across the board, allowing the private sector to flourish. Wall Street soared, wages rose, and consumer goods flooded the market. America's productivity reached new heights. His Treasury Secretary, Andrew Mellon, called it the scientific tax cut, the idea that lower taxes would spur growth and increase revenue, and it worked. Factories built automobiles by the millions. Americans bought them on credit and drove farther than ever before. Radios, refrigerators, and washing machines filled homes that only a decade earlier had known none of these luxuries. To the world, it seemed the American dream had finally been perfected. Coolidge, though, was not blinded by prosperity. Beneath his stern expression and dry humor was a deeply moral man who distrusted excess. He worried that Americans were becoming careless, addicted to consumption, lulled into complacency by wealth. Prosperity, he warned quietly, is only an instrument to be used, not a deity to be worshipped. But few were listening. The Roaring Twenties roared on a symphony of jazz, speculation, and confidence. Coolidge's presidency was also marked by peace and restraint abroad. He believed the United States should lead by example, not by force. Under his administration, America hosted the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, a multinational treaty that renounced war as a tool of policy. It was idealistic, perhaps naive, but it reflected the deep yearning for peace that followed World War I. At home, Coolidge expanded civil aviation, modernized the postal system, and signed the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, granting citizenship to all Native Americans. Yet his presidency was also limited by its silence. He avoided confronting the growing inequalities of wealth, the struggles of farmers left behind by industrialization, and the racial violence that still scarred the South. He saw the presidency as a trust, not a crusade. His philosophy was simple: fewer laws, less interference, and absolute honesty. In this, he succeeded. Corruption vanished from Washington. The scandals of the Harding era were replaced by dignity and efficiency. Coolidge was famously quiet, so much so that the press nicknamed him Silent Cal. At public dinners, reporters would lean forward, hoping to catch his words. Once a woman seated beside him said, "Mr. President, I bet I can get you to say more than 2 words." Coolidge smiled faintly and replied, "You lose." Yet behind that silence was a mind as sharp as it was disciplined. He read constantly, thought deeply, and governed through reason, not emotion. His restraint became his strength and, ultimately, his legacy. In 1924, Coolidge ran for a full term and won by a landslide. The nation loved him not for what he promised, but for what he refused to do. He presided over a country that seemed unstoppable, guided by invisible forces of progress and prosperity. But by the late 1920s, subtle warning signs appeared. Credit was expanding faster than income. Stock speculation surged. Farmers struggled under falling prices. Coolidge noticed and worried, but chose not to interfere. "I do not choose to run," he announced in 1927, declining to seek another term. It was a typically Coolidge decision, measured, modest, final. When he left the White House in 1929, he was the embodiment of conservative virtue, the president who had done little, but in doing little, had preserved much. The economy was booming, the nation at peace, and his popularity immense. He retired to Northampton, Massachusetts, where he wrote his autobiography in plain, graceful prose. "It is a great advantage," he wrote, "to have a president who knows when to stop." But less than a year after he left office, the illusion of endless prosperity shattered. In October 1929, the stock market crashed, triggering the Great Depression, the greatest economic catastrophe in American history. Some later blamed Coolidge's policies of minimal regulation and easy credit for feeding the bubble that burst. Others saw him as the last guardian of a simpler age, undone by forces no one could control. Calvin Coolidge died quietly in 1933, at the age of 60. True to form, he left behind no grand speeches, no dramatic farewells, only the memory of restraint, integrity, and humility. History remembers him as a paradox, a silent man who led during the loudest decade, a minimalist in an age of excess, a calm before the storm. Calvin Coolidge once said, "Character is the only secure foundation of the state," and in his time, he gave the nation that character, a model of virtue, prudence, and order. He was the 11th Republican President of the United States, the guardian of prosperity, the keeper of calm, and the quiet voice at the heart of the Roaring Twenties. And when the noise of the age finally faded, silence remained, a reminder that sometimes the truest strength lies not in how loudly a man speaks, but in how steadfastly he stands. The humanitarian president and the fall from prosperity. The year was 1929. America stood at the height of its glory. The stock market soared, factories thrived, and the hum of industry filled the air like a hymn to modern progress. No nation on earth seemed stronger or more confident. The Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, Grant, and Coolidge, had become the symbol of prosperity itself. And at the center of it all stood a man whose life seemed to embody the American dream. His name was Herbert Hoover, the 12th Republican President of the United States. A self-made man, an engineer, and a humanitarian, he was the symbol of what hard work and faith could achieve. Herbert Clark Hoover was born in 1874 in West Branch, Iowa, the first president born west of the Mississippi River. His parents were Quakers, devout and modest people who taught him honesty, thrift, and service. But tragedy struck early. By the age of 9, both his parents were gone. The orphaned boy was sent to live with relatives in Oregon, where he worked hard and studied harder. Hoover's rise was not by privilege, but by perseverance. He attended Stanford University as part of its first class in 1891, a bold new school in a bold new land. There, he studied geology and engineering, disciplines of precision and endurance. When he graduated, he took his skills abroad, working as a mining engineer in Australia, China, and Europe. By his mid-30s, Hoover was a millionaire, a rare feat in his era. But wealth never defined him. What set Hoover apart was his instinct for organization and his passion for service. When World War I erupted, he became one of the world's great humanitarians. From his London office, he organized massive relief efforts to feed Belgium, a small nation starved by war. His commission for relief in Belgium saved millions from hunger. Later, he directed food distribution across war-torn Europe, feeding soldiers, refugees, and children alike. To the starving world, he became known simply as the Great Humanitarian. When the war ended, President Woodrow Wilson summoned him home to serve as U.S. Food Administrator, and later, Republican Presidents Harding and Coolidge appointed him Secretary of Commerce. In that post, Hoover became the architect of modern American business policy. He encouraged efficiency, cooperation, and innovation. To many, he represented the future, a man who could manage prosperity itself. So in 1928, when Calvin Coolidge chose not to run again, Hoover became the obvious successor. The Republican slogan said it all: a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage. Prosperity seemed eternal. Hoover won the presidency in a landslide. When he took the oath of office in March 1929, he declared, "We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before." Those words would soon haunt him. For 6 months, the good times rolled on. The stock market reached dizzying heights. Investors bought stocks not with cash, but on credit, borrowing against the future. It was an illusion of wealth built on fragile faith. And then, in October 1929, that illusion collapsed. On Black Tuesday, the stock market crashed. Billions of dollars in wealth vanished in days. Panic spread like wildfire. Banks failed, businesses closed, and families lost their savings overnight. The Great Depression had begun. Hoover, the master of order, now faced chaos on a scale no American leader had ever known. Unemployment soared. By 1932, 1 in 4 workers was jobless. Breadlines stretched for blocks. Farmers lost their land. Homeless camps called Hoovervilles appeared on the outskirts of cities, grim symbols of despair. Yet Hoover refused to believe the nation was helpless. His instincts were those of an engineer to fix the system, not to abandon it. He rejected direct government handouts, believing that self-reliance and voluntary cooperation would restore the economy. He called on businesses to maintain wages and charities to expand aid. But as the crisis deepened, goodwill was not enough. In 1930, Hoover signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, hoping to protect American farmers and industries. Instead, it backfired. Other nations retaliated with tariffs of their own, strangling global trade. The Depression grew worse. Desperate, Hoover launched a series of unprecedented federal measures, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which lent money to struggling banks and railroads. Massive public works projects, like the dam that would later bear his name, and expanded credit through the Federal Reserve. Yet by then, it was too late. The economy had collapsed too far, and public faith in Hoover had evaporated. The same man who had fed millions abroad now seemed unable to feed his own countrymen. His compassion, though genuine, was buried beneath his caution and his belief that government aid would undermine individual spirit. The breaking point came in 1932, when thousands of World War I veterans, the so-called Bonus Army, marched on Washington, demanding early payment of their promised bonuses. They built camps on the Capitol's doorstep. When Congress rejected their demands, clashes erupted. Hoover, fearing anarchy, ordered the army to clear the camps. The sight of U.S. soldiers driving out veterans with tanks and tear gas shattered what little trust remained. It was one of the darkest moments of his presidency. That fall, Hoover faced Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt, who promised a New Deal for the American people. The contrast was clear. Hoover, the engineer of order. Roosevelt, the prophet of change. In the election of 1932, the people chose hope over restraint. Hoover carried only 6 states. He left office humiliated, but unbroken. In his farewell address, he defended his philosophy. The progress of America is the fruit of individual initiative, of the independent character of our people. History would judge him harshly as the president who presided over the Great Depression, the man who failed to act boldly as millions suffered. But time revealed another side of him. After leaving Washington, Hoover returned to private life, devoting himself once more to humanitarian service. During World War II, President Roosevelt, the very man who had defeated him, asked for his help in organizing food relief for war-torn nations. Later, President Harry Truman called upon him to lead global hunger relief once again. The world still trusted Herbert Hoover, the man who had saved Europe once before. In the twilight of his life, Hoover reflected on his journey from orphan to president, from success to failure, from condemnation to redemption. He lived to the age of 90, witnessing the rise and fall of wars, ideologies, and economies. By the time of his death in 1964, America had come to see him differently, not as the architect of ruin, but as a man caught between eras, between the faith of the old America and the demands of the new. He once said, "When there is a lack of honor in government, the morals of the whole people are poisoned." That belief guided his life, even when it cost him popularity. Herbert Hoover was the 12th Republican President of the United States, the engineer, the humanitarian, the man who believed in human effort above all else. He led with conscience, stumbled in crisis, and redeemed himself through service. His presidency was a tragedy, but his life was a testament that character endures longer than fortune, and that even in failure, integrity remains unbroken. Herbert Hoover is a man who built prosperity and bore its collapse with dignity. Dwight D. Eisenhower, 1953 to 1961, the general who led in peace the Second World War, had ended, but the shadow it cast stretched across the earth. The atomic age had dawned, the Cold War had begun, and the world's greatest military power now faced a new kind of conflict, not on battlefields of mud and blood, but in the hearts and minds of nations. And in that tense new era, the American people turned to a man who symbolized victory, discipline, and calm, a man who had led the free world to triumph in its darkest hour. His name was Dwight David Eisenhower, the 13th Republican President of the United States, and one of the most trusted figures in modern history. Dwight Eisenhower was born in 1890 in Denison, Texas, and raised in Abilene, Kansas, a town of hard work, modesty, and faith. He was one of 7 sons, raised by parents who believed in honesty, duty, and education. Abilene, Eisenhower would later say, is the home of my boyhood, and I hope my life has reflected the values I learned there. He entered West Point in 1911, not yet the great general history would know, but a disciplined young man drawn to the order and service of military life. During World War I, he never saw combat, but he trained troops tirelessly, learning the power of organization, logistics, and leadership. He understood that wars were not won only by courage, but by coordination, by the unseen systems that sustained armies. By the time World War II erupted, Eisenhower had become a master of command. His rise was meteoric. In 1942, he was appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces in Europe, tasked with leading the largest military coalition in human history. In June 1944, he made the decision that would define his life, the D-Day invasion of Normandy. On the eve of the attack, he wrote 2 notes, one accepting victory and one accepting blame if it failed. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, he wrote, it is mine alone. The invasion succeeded. The Allies liberated Europe, defeated Nazi Germany, and brought the war to an end. Eisenhower became not only a general, but a legend, a symbol of resolve and humility. After the war, he served as the first Supreme Commander of NATO, helping rebuild Western Europe and defend it against Soviet expansion. He could have retired a hero, but destiny called again. By 1952, the United States was weary of war once more. This time in Korea, the Cold War loomed large, and the American people longed for stability and strength. Both political parties sought Eisenhower as their candidate. Though he had never held elected office, his popularity transcended politics. In the end, he chose the Republican Party, saying simply, "I shall go to Korea." Those words became his campaign promise and his mission. Eisenhower won the presidency in a landslide, defeating Democrat Adlai Stevenson and bringing the Republicans back to power after 2 decades of Democratic dominance. When he took office in January 1953, Eisenhower inherited a divided world. The Soviet Union had the atomic bomb. The Korean War raged on. McCarthyism gripped Washington with paranoia. But Ike, as the nation affectionately called him, met each challenge not with fury, but with calm. He negotiated an armistice in Korea within months, ending 3 years of bloody stalemate. He restrained the hawks in his own party, choosing peace where others demanded escalation. Yet his peace was not weakness, it was peace through strength. Eisenhower believed that the surest way to prevent war was to prepare for it. He modernized America's nuclear arsenal, built long-range bombers, and established the Eisenhower Doctrine, pledging U.S. support to nations resisting communist aggression. In the Middle East, he balanced military power with restraint, always wary of letting fear control policy. Every gun that is made, he once warned, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies a theft from those who hunger and are not fed. Under Eisenhower, the 1950s became an era of extraordinary stability and prosperity. The economy boomed. Suburbs expanded. Highways stretched across the continent under the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, the largest public works project in American history. It connected cities, fueled commerce, and reshaped American life. This was the age of the interstate highway system, a vision Eisenhower had drawn from his days as a soldier, when he saw firsthand how roads could determine a nation's strength. He wanted not just a system of transportation, but a network of national unity. At home, the nation changed rapidly. Television, rock and roll, and consumer culture defined a new generation. Beneath the calm surface, however, deep currents stirred, especially in the struggle for civil rights. In 1954, the Supreme Court delivered its landmark decision in Brown v. Board of Education, declaring racial segregation in public schools unconstitutional. Southern states resisted. In 1957, when mobs in Little Rock, Arkansas, defied integration, Eisenhower acted. Though reluctant to use federal force, he sent the 101st Airborne Division to escort 9 black students into Central High School. "Our personal opinions have no bearing on the matter of enforcement of the law," he said. "The responsibility rests with the President, and I will meet it." It was one of the most decisive moments of his presidency and a defining moment for the nation's moral progress. Eisenhower's leadership style was deceptively quiet. Critics called him passive, but his calm masked extraordinary discipline. He preferred delegation to domination, logic to ideology. In meetings, he listened more than he spoke, but when he did speak, his words carried the weight of command. Behind the scenes, he carefully managed a global balancing act, confronting Soviet power without tipping the world into nuclear war. His administration supported covert actions to contain communism in places like Iran, Guatemala, and Vietnam, actions that reflected the moral complexity of Cold War strategy. He understood that peace was fragile, but necessary. As the 1950s drew to a close, America stood stronger than ever, prosperous, secure, and respected. But Eisenhower's greatest warning came not about enemies abroad, but dangers within. In his farewell address of 1961, he issued a sober message to the future. We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. He had spent his life in the military, yet he feared its unchecked power more than any foreign army. His words became prophetic, echoing through every decade that followed. Dwight Eisenhower left the presidency with one of the highest approval ratings in American history. He retired to his farm in Gettysburg, where he painted, wrote, and reflected on a life of service. When he died in 1969, the world mourned not just a leader, but an era, a time when calm strength, steady faith, and quiet honor guided a superpower through peril. He had led armies across Europe, yet he never glorified war. He had commanded nations, yet he remained humble. He was the soldier who brought peace, the general who trusted reason over rage. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the man who led in war and governed in peace. The 13th Republican President of the United States, a leader whose greatest victories were not in battlefields, but in restraint. He proved that the truest form of strength is not the power to destroy, but the wisdom to hold that power in check. Richard Nixon, 1969 to 1974. The rise, the reach, and the ruin of a president he rose from nothing. From the dry dust of California farmland, from the shadow of poverty and loss. From a family that struggled just to survive, and through sheer will, he climbed to the highest office on earth. He was brilliant, driven, complex, and haunted. His name was Richard Milhous Nixon, the 14th Republican President of the United States, and one of the most remarkable and tragic figures in American history. Richard Nixon was born in 1913 in Yorba Linda, California, the son of a struggling grocer and a devout Quaker mother. His early life was defined by hardship. 2 of his brothers died young from illness. His father's temper was hard, his mother's faith unyielding. But in that harsh world, Nixon learned endurance, a cold, hard kind that would define his life. He was quiet, studious, and fiercely ambitious. He attended Whittier College, then Duke University Law School, where he graduated near the top of his class. When World War II erupted, Nixon joined the Navy and served in the Pacific, rising to the rank of lieutenant commander. His service was competent, not heroic, but it gave him discipline and confidence. After the war, he entered politics, part of the new generation of veterans determined to shape America's post-war world. In 1946, he ran for Congress against a popular New Deal Democrat, Jerry Voorhis. Nixon campaigned relentlessly, portraying his opponent as soft on communism. He won, and in doing so, discovered his political weapon: relentless attack. In Washington, the Cold War had just begun, and fear of communism gripped the nation. Nixon rose fast by mastering that fear. As a young member of the House Un-American Activities Committee, he helped investigate alleged communist infiltration in government. His questioning of Alger Hiss, a former State Department official accused of espionage, made him a national figure. To many, Nixon was a patriot defending America. To others, he was an ambitious man exploiting paranoia. Both were true. In 1950, he won a U.S. Senate seat from California, again through a brutal campaign. 2 years later, at just 39 years old, he was chosen as Dwight D. Eisenhower's running mate. As vice president, Nixon served 8 years under Eisenhower, loyal, tireless, and sharp. He traveled the world debating Soviet leaders, defending capitalism, and representing the United States abroad. In Moscow, he famously faced off with Nikita Khrushchev in the kitchen debate, arguing that freedom and prosperity, not ideology, defined American greatness. By 1960, Nixon was the natural heir to Eisenhower's legacy. He ran for president against a young Democrat from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy. The race was close. The country divided. Their televised debates became legendary. Kennedy appeared youthful and composed. Nixon looked tense and weary. The power of television had arrived, and it was not kind to Nixon. Kennedy won, narrowly. 2 years later, Nixon ran for governor of California and lost again. Bitter and exhausted, he told reporters, "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore." It sounded like the end of his career. But Nixon was not a man who surrendered. In the 1960s, as America convulsed with war, protest, and social upheaval, he saw his chance for redemption. He rebuilt his image, quietly courting conservatives and moderates alike, those who longed for law, order, and stability in an age of chaos. In 1968, amid the Vietnam War and the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy, Nixon ran again for president. His message was simple: peace with honor. He promised to end the war, heal the divisions, and restore faith in America. The silent majority, the millions who felt unheard amid protest and change, rallied behind him. He won. When Nixon took office in January 1969, the nation was fractured and weary. The Vietnam War had claimed tens of thousands of American lives. Cities burned with unrest. Trust in government had eroded. Nixon saw himself as the man destined to restore balance. He began to withdraw American troops from Vietnam, pursuing a policy he called Vietnamization, training South Vietnamese forces to fight their own war. At the same time, he expanded bombing campaigns in neighboring Cambodia, seeking to pressure the North Vietnamese to negotiate. It was a strategy of both diplomacy and destruction, and it divided the nation further. Yet Nixon's foreign policy achievements would become some of the most consequential in American history. Guided by his brilliant but controversial national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, Nixon reshaped global power. In 1972, he shocked the world by traveling to Communist China, the first U.S. president ever to do so. For decades, the two nations had been enemies. But Nixon saw what few others did: that engaging China could shift the balance of the Cold War. His handshake with Mao Zedong opened a new era of diplomacy and transformed the global order. Later that year, Nixon traveled to Moscow, signing arms control agreements with the Soviet Union, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty SALT-I, and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. These agreements began to slow the nuclear arms race and ease Cold War tensions. He called it détente, a relaxation of hostility. For a moment, it seemed he had achieved what no one thought possible: peace with both Cold War giants. At home, Nixon also pursued reforms that surprised his critics. He established the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. strengthened the Clean Air Act, and supported affirmative action in federal contracting. He ended the draft, restored relations with Native Americans, and quietly expanded social programs. He was, in many ways, a paradox, a conservative who expanded government power, a cold strategist with flashes of compassion, a man capable of brilliance and self-destruction. In 1972, he was re-elected in a landslide, winning 49 states. He was at the height of power, respected abroad, dominant at home. But beneath the triumph, something dark was already spreading. During his campaign, operatives linked to Nixon's re-election committee had broken into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington. They were caught a small scandal at first, dismissed as a third-rate burglary, but what followed would destroy his presidency. Investigations by journalists, Congress, and the courts revealed a vast web of political espionage, illegal wiretaps, and cover-ups, all orchestrated by men close to Nixon. As the evidence mounted, tapes from the Oval Office exposed the president himself, discussing how to conceal the crime. The man who had built his career on control and secrecy was undone by his own need for both. In August 1974, facing almost certain impeachment, Richard Nixon resigned, the first president in American history to do so. He left the White House quietly, accompanied by his wife, Pat, and his daughters. Before boarding the helicopter, he turned, smiled faintly, and raised both hands in his famous V gesture, victory, or perhaps farewell. That afternoon, he was gone. His vice president, Gerald Ford, took the oath of office and declared, "Our long national nightmare is over." But for Nixon, the nightmare had just begun. He retreated to his home in California, disgraced but unbroken. For years, he worked to rebuild his reputation, writing books and offering advice to future presidents. Over time, he became a kind of elder statesman, respected again for his knowledge of world affairs. But the stain of Watergate never left him. He died in 1994, at the age of 81. At his funeral, leaders from around the world came to honor him, the soldier of the Cold War, the architect of peace with China, and the man who had fallen from the heights of power to the depths of disgrace. History will always remember Richard Nixon for both his genius and his flaws, his triumphs and his tragedy. He once said, "Only if you have been in the deepest valley can you ever know how magnificent it is to be on the highest mountain." Nixon knew both better than anyone. Richard Milhous Nixon, the fighter, the strategist, the peacemaker, the paradox. He was the 14th Republican President of the United States, a man who opened the door to China, reshaped the Cold War, and showed the world both the strength and the fragility of American power. He reached higher than most and fell farther than any. And in his rise and ruin, America saw its own reflection. Ambitious, brilliant, flawed, and forever human. The accidental president who tried to heal America. It was August 9, 1974. The sun rose over Washington as one man, burdened by scandal and sorrow, prepared to leave the White House forever. His helicopter waited. His staff stood silently, eyes heavy with disbelief. When Richard Nixon boarded Marine One and lifted into the sky, the long national nightmare of Watergate came to an end. And in that moment, without election, without campaign, without celebration, Gerald Rudolph Ford became President of the United States. He had never sought the presidency, never imagined it. Yet fate placed the weight of a wounded nation on his shoulders. He took the oath of office in the East Room, surrounded by the ghosts of betrayal and the exhaustion of the Watergate years. Looking into the cameras, he spoke the words that defined his presidency. "My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over. Our Constitution works. Our great republic is a government of laws and not of men. Here the people rule." They were the right words, simple, honest, and steady. The kind of words the country needed after years of secrecy, cynicism, and political darkness. Gerald Ford was not a man of grandeur, nor a master of ambition. He was a man of character. Born in 1913 in Omaha, Nebraska, and raised in Grand Rapids, Michigan, Ford grew up with the virtues of the Midwest: hard work, humility, and decency. His parents divorced when he was an infant, and he took the name of his stepfather, Gerald Rudolph Ford, a kind and stable man who raised him with love and discipline. Ford excelled in sports, academics, and service. At the University of Michigan, he was a football star, strong, calm, and reliable. His teammates called him steady. That steadiness would become his trademark in politics and life. After graduating from Yale Law School, Ford joined the Navy during World War II, serving aboard the aircraft carrier Monterey in the Pacific. He witnessed typhoons, battle, and the weight of command, experiences that forged a quiet courage in him. After the war, Ford entered Congress in 1949 and served for 25 years, representing Michigan's 5th District. He rose not through force or flash, but through fairness. Republicans and Democrats alike trusted him. He was appointed House Minority Leader, respected even by his opponents as a man of honesty in a city that often lacked it. When Vice President Spiro Agnew resigned in scandal in 1973, President Nixon needed someone the nation could trust. Ford was that man. He was confirmed overwhelmingly by Congress as Vice President, the first appointed under the 25th Amendment. Less than a year later, Nixon's own presidency collapsed, and Ford, suddenly and reluctantly, became the 38th President of the United States. He entered office with no election victory, no political base, and a public weary of deceit. His task was monumental: to restore faith in the presidency, to unite a divided people, and to remind the world that America's democracy still endured. For a brief moment, the country seemed ready to believe in him. Ford's plain-spoken honesty was refreshing. He opened his White House to the press, promised transparency, and refused the trappings of arrogance. He walked the halls with ease, shaking hands, smiling, laughing, the antithesis of Nixon's secrecy. But just 1 month into his presidency, Ford made a decision that would define his legacy forever. On September 8, 1974, he granted a full and unconditional pardon to Richard Nixon for any crimes he might have committed as president. The country erupted in outrage. Millions believed the pardon was a secret deal, a betrayal of justice. Ford's approval ratings collapsed overnight. His integrity, once his greatest strength, was suddenly questioned by the very people who had trusted him most. But Ford had not acted from corruption or self-interest. He had acted from conviction. He believed that the country could not heal if the wounds of Watergate were left open. The American people, he said, need to move forward, not backward. Privately, he told his aides, "I had to get the monkey off the country's back." He knew it would cost him politically, and it did, but he never regretted it. Years later, historians would see it as one of the most courageous acts of modern politics, the sacrifice of popularity for the sake of peace. Even as Watergate faded, Ford faced crises on all fronts. The economy, once strong under Eisenhower, now faltered under inflation and unemployment. The oil embargo of 1973 had driven up prices and slowed growth. Ford declared war on inflation with the slogan, "Whip inflation, now or when." But the recession deepened, and his cheerful campaign buttons could not mask the pain of rising costs and lost jobs. Abroad, the Cold War burned on. Ford inherited a fragile world détente with the Soviet Union was faltering, and the Vietnam War still haunted American conscience. In 1975, the final chapter of that war unfolded. Saigon fell to communist forces as desperate South Vietnamese clung to departing U.S. helicopters. Ford ordered the evacuation of thousands of refugees, saving lives, even as America's longest war ended in humiliation. That same year, he signed the Helsinki Accords, a landmark agreement with 35 nations, including the Soviet Union, affirming human rights and peaceful cooperation in Europe. Though criticized at the time, the accords would later inspire dissidents behind the Iron Curtain, planting seeds for freedom decades later. Through it all, Ford remained steady, perhaps too steady for the political storms of the 1970s. He was decent when the times demanded drama, calm when the country craved passion. In 1976, he sought election in his own right, facing a strong challenge from within his party by the conservative governor of California, Ronald Reagan. The Republican convention that summer was tense and divided, but Ford narrowly secured the nomination. In the general election, he faced Democrat Jimmy Carter, a fresh face promising honesty and moral renewal. Ford campaigned tirelessly, but the shadow of the Nixon pardon never fully lifted. He lost narrowly, one of the closest elections in modern history. When Ford left the White House in January 1977, he carried no bitterness. He simply smiled and said, "I guess I'm a Ford, not a Lincoln." It was a joke, but also a truth. He was not a visionary or a revolutionary. He was a caretaker, a healer, a decent man in indecent times. History would come to see him differently than the headlines of his day. Over time, Americans recognized that Ford had done what was hardest. He had steadied the ship of state after its greatest storm. He had restored trust to the presidency by living it with honesty. He once said, "Truth is the glue that holds government together, not only our government, but civilization itself." When Gerald Ford died in 2006 at the age of 93, the nation remembered not the man who lost an election, but the man who preserved democracy. Presidents and citizens alike praised his integrity. His casket lay in the Capitol Rotunda, where those who had lived through Watergate came to say goodbye to the president who had restored their faith. Gerald R. Ford, the accidental president, the man who pardoned his predecessor and paid the price, the man who healed without bitterness and led without fear. He was the 15th Republican President of the United States, a man who proved that in America, greatness is not only measured in power, but in character. He reminded the nation that leadership is not about ambition, but about courage, and that sometimes the hardest act of strength is forgiveness. Ronald Reagan, 1981 to 1989, the great communicator and the rebirth of American confidence. By the late 1970s, America had lost something deeper than prosperity. It had lost faith in itself. The long shadow of Vietnam, the humiliation of Watergate, and the pain of economic stagnation had left the nation tired, uncertain, and divided. Inflation rose, jobs vanished, and the Iranian hostage crisis played out nightly on television, a symbol of American power seemingly humbled. Then, in 1980, a new voice emerged, warm, confident, and familiar. It was the voice of a man who spoke not as a politician, but as a believer in the American story. His name was Ronald Wilson Reagan, the 16th Republican President of the United States, an actor, a governor, and soon the face of a conservative revolution that would reshape the modern world. Ronald Reagan was born in 1911 in Tampico, Illinois, the son of a modest shoe salesman and a devout mother who believed in the goodness of people and the power of faith. He grew up in small towns across the Midwest, shaped by the values of hard work, optimism, and decency. His childhood was not easy. His father struggled with alcoholism, and his family often moved, but Reagan's spirit was unshakable. He went to Eureka College, where he studied economics and sociology, played football, and discovered a lifelong gift, the ability to connect with people. After graduation, he became a radio sportscaster, then found his way to Hollywood. There in the 1930s and 40s, he became a familiar face on the silver screen, a leading man in films like Newt Rockne, All-American, and King's Row. To millions, he was charming, confident, and hopeful, the embodiment of the American ideal. But behind the easy smile was a man of conviction and curiosity, deeply interested in politics and the direction of his country. As the years passed, Reagan's views evolved. Once a New Deal Democrat, he grew increasingly wary of big government and the spread of communism. By the 1950s, as host of General Electric Theater, he traveled the country giving speeches about self-reliance, freedom, and faith in the individual. "I didn't leave the Democratic Party," he would later say. the party left me. In 1964, Reagan delivered a televised speech for Republican candidate Barry Goldwater, A Time for Choosing. It electrified the nation. He spoke of freedom as something fragile and sacred, something always one generation away from extinction. Overnight, the actor became a political star. 2 years later, he was elected governor of California, where he served 2 terms, cutting taxes, curbing spending, and confronting campus unrest with firmness and humor. By 1980, after a failed presidential bid in 1976, Reagan was ready. America, disillusioned by years of weakness and inflation, was ready too. He campaigned on 3 simple promises: restore prosperity, rebuild strength, and renew faith. He asked the people, "Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?" And the answer was clear. In November 1980, Ronald Reagan defeated incumbent Jimmy Carter in a landslide, winning 44 states. The oldest man ever elected president at the time. Reagan took the oath of office on a cold January day in 1981. Minutes later, the 52 American hostages held in Iran were released. It seemed as if the long season of doubt had finally ended. Reagan's philosophy was as clear as his optimism. Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. His administration launched a bold economic experiment, a fusion of free market principles and patriotic faith. It was called Reaganomics, centered on tax cuts, deregulation, and reduced government spending. The Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981 slashed income taxes by 25% over 3 years, aiming to unleash entrepreneurship and investment. At first, the results were painful. Inflation persisted, unemployment rose, and critics mocked trickle-down economics. But by 1983, the economy began to roar. Inflation fell, millions of jobs were created, and growth surged. America regained its confidence. At home, Reagan's message was simple yet powerful: hard work, family, faith, and freedom. He restored pride in the flag, revived the spirit of patriotism, and reminded Americans that greatness came not from government, but from the people themselves. Abroad, his mission was even larger: to win the Cold War without firing a shot. He called the Soviet Union what few dared to say: an evil empire. His words shocked some, inspired others, and sent a clear signal: the age of détente was over. Reagan believed that peace came through strength, not compromise. He began a massive military buildup, the largest in peacetime history, rebuilding the Navy, developing new bombers, missiles, and defense systems. In 1983, he announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, a plan to create a missile shield using space-based technology. Critics called it Star Wars, but Reagan's goal was not conquest, it was deterrence. He wanted to make nuclear war unthinkable. His confidence unnerved the Soviets, but it also opened the door to dialogue. When Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power in 1985, Reagan saw an opportunity. The 2 men, the hardline anti-communist and the young reformer, began an extraordinary diplomatic relationship. They met in Geneva, Reykjavik, Washington, and Moscow summits that blended tension and trust, suspicion and hope. At Reykjavik, they nearly agreed to abolish nuclear weapons altogether. And though that dream failed, they laid the groundwork for the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty (INF) in 1987, the first major arms reduction agreement of the Cold War. That same year, standing before the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, Reagan issued his most famous challenge: "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." 2 years after Reagan left office, the Berlin Wall fell, and 2 years after that, the Soviet Union itself dissolved. The Cold War, the defining conflict of the 20th century, ended not with a bang, but with a triumph of freedom. At home, Reagan faced storms and setbacks. His administration was rocked by the Iran-Contra affair, the secret operation that illegally funded Nicaraguan rebels with money from arms sales to Iran. The revelation tarnished his reputation and raised questions about control within his White House. Yet through it all, Reagan's personal popularity endured. The people forgave him, or perhaps believed in him too deeply to condemn him. He was called the great communicator for a reason. His speeches, filled with simple language and moral clarity, resonated across divides. He spoke not as a bureaucrat, but as a storyteller, turning politics into poetry. He made Americans believe again in themselves, in their purpose, and in the promise of their country. In 1989, Ronald Reagan left office after 2 terms. The economy was booming, inflation was low, and America stood tall on the world stage. He had rekindled the nation's faith in its destiny. As he departed, he said simply, "My friends, we did it. We weren't just marking time. We made a difference." In his later years, Reagan retreated from public life as Alzheimer's disease slowly dimmed the brightness of his mind. In a final letter to the American people, he wrote, "I now begin the journey that will lead me into the sunset of my life. I know that for America, there will always be a bright dawn ahead." He died in 2004, mourned by millions. His coffin lay in the Capitol Rotunda, beneath the dome he had once filled with faith. Across the nation, Americans, young and old, rich and poor, conservative and liberal, paused to remember not just the man, but the feeling he gave them. Hope. Ronald Reagan, the great communicator, the optimist, the president who made America believe in itself again. He was the 16th Republican President of the United States, the man who turned conservatism into conviction, who stood firm against tyranny, and who gave the world a glimpse of freedom's enduring fire. He reminded a weary nation that patriotism was not nostalgia, it was courage. And in doing so, he renewed the promise of America, that this shining city on a hill would never dim, as long as her people kept faith in the light. George H.W. Bush, 1989 to 1993, the president of a new world order. When Ronald Reagan left the White House in 1989, he handed the torch of American leadership to a man who had stood quietly beside him for 8 years, a man of experience, discipline, and dignity. He was not an actor nor a crusader, but a statesman forged in the fire of service. His name was George Herbert Walker Bush, the 17th Republican President of the United States, the last of a generation that had fought in World War II, and the first to lead a world no longer divided by the Cold War. George H.W. Bush was born in 1924 into a life of privilege, but also of purpose. His father, Prescott Bush, was a U.S. Senator from Connecticut, and his mother instilled in him a lifelong sense of modesty and moral duty. Yet it was not comfort that defined him, but courage. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, the young Bush, barely 18, enlisted in the U.S. Navy. He became the Navy's youngest pilot, flying torpedo bombers in the Pacific. In 1944, his plane was shot down over the ocean. He parachuted into the sea, floating for hours before being rescued by a U.S. submarine. 2 of his crewmates were lost. Bush would never forget them. That moment between life and death, duty and deliverance, shaped him forever. He had seen sacrifice up close, and it gave him a quiet strength that would carry him through every trial ahead. After the war, he married his sweetheart, Barbara Pierce, and together they built a family that would become one of America's most enduring political dynasties. Bush earned a degree at Yale, then moved to Texas to work in the oil business. He built success not from inheritance, but from persistence, blending Eastern refinement with Western grit. But public service called him again. In 1966, Bush was elected to Congress. Over the next 2 decades, he served as U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Envoy to China, Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and Vice President of the United States. Few men entered the Oval Office with a broader understanding of the world or a deeper respect for its dangers. When he took the oath of office on January 20, 1989, Bush inherited a world on the brink of transformation. The Cold War that had defined every presidency since Truman was nearing its end. The Soviet Union trembled. Eastern Europe stirred. The Berlin Wall, long the symbol of division, still stood, But not for long. Moss's approach to this extraordinary moment was cautious, deliberate, and humble. Where Reagan had thundered, Bush listened. He believed in diplomacy, coalition, and prudence in guiding change, not forcing it. In 1989, as revolutions swept across Eastern Europe, communist governments fell one by one in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. And in November of that year, the Berlin Wall crumbled. Germans climbed its ruins in celebration, and the world watched in awe. It was the triumph of freedom that generations had dreamed of, the end of the Cold War. And through it all, a steady hand kept peace. He resisted the urge for triumphalism, understanding that the collapse of an empire demanded care, not gloating. He worked quietly with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev to ensure a peaceful transition. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved, ending 70 years of communist rule. The United States emerged as the world's sole superpower. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed that a new age of cooperation and peace had dawned. Bush called it a new world order, not of domination, but of diplomacy, where nations would work together to uphold peace and justice. His vision was ambitious, and for a time, it seemed within reach. But the post-Cold War world would test that vision almost immediately. In August 1990, Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, invaded the small oil-rich nation of Kuwait. The aggression shocked the world. Bush, a veteran of war and diplomacy, saw the danger clearly, a tyrant threatening global stability. But he also saw the opportunity to prove that collective security still mattered. Rather than act alone, Bush built a massive international coalition, over 30 nations united under the United Nations. It was a diplomatic masterstroke, unmatched since World War II. American troops joined allies from Britain, France, Saudi Arabia, and beyond in Operation Desert Shield, preparing to defend Saudi Arabia and demand Iraq's withdrawal. When diplomacy failed, Bush gave the order. In January 1991, the air war began. Operation Desert Storm. Precision bombs lit up the night sky over Baghdad as the world watched the first televised war in real time. Within 6 weeks, the Iraqi army was crushed, Kuwait was liberated, and Bush announced, "By God, we've kicked the Vietnam syndrome once and for all." It was one of the swiftest and most decisive victories in modern military history. Bush's approval ratings soared to nearly 90%. He stood at the height of power, the architect of a new global order, the man who had ended one war and avoided another. Yet at home, storms gathered. The economic boom of the 1980s began to fade. A recession gripped the nation. Unemployment rose. The federal deficit grew. Bush, committed to fiscal discipline, made a painful choice, breaking his 1988 campaign promise. Read my lips, no new taxes. It was a decision of principle, but also of political cost. Conservatives felt betrayed. Democrats saw weakness. The same steadiness that had guided his foreign policy made him appear indecisive at home. Bush's presidency also faced social and cultural shifts, from debates over civil rights and crime to the emergence of new global issues like climate change and humanitarian intervention. He signed the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, one of the most significant civil rights laws in U.S. history, ensuring equality for millions. He also signed the Clean Air Act amendments targeting pollution and acid rain. But by 1992, the glow of victory had faded. The economy struggled, and the American people, anxious and restless, looked for change. Into that uncertainty stepped a young governor from Arkansas, Bill Clinton, and a populist businessman, Ross Perot, who split the conservative vote. In the election of 1992, Bush lost. He accepted defeat with grace, telling the nation, "We have had the honor of serving the greatest country on earth. I will always cherish this noble work." He left office quietly, as he had lived with dignity, humility, and love for his country. In the years that followed, history softened its view. His prudence, once seen as timidity, came to be recognized as wisdom. His foreign policy, once criticized for restraint, came to be admired for its balance. And his decency, so often overshadowed by flashier figures, came to symbolize the end of an age when service meant sacrifice, not spectacle. In his later years, he saw his son, George W. Bush, follow him to the presidency, a rare and bittersweet legacy. The elder Bush devoted his retirement to humanitarian work, often alongside former rival Bill Clinton, embodying the grace and unity that defined his life. When George H.W. Bush died in 2018 at the age of 94, he was eulogized as a man of honor, courage, and compassion. At his funeral, his son said, "He showed me what it means to be a president who leads with integrity, who serves with humility, and who loves with his whole heart." George Herbert Walker Bush, the pilot who fell from the skies and rose to the presidency, the diplomat who ended a Cold War without firing a shot, the leader who built coalitions instead of walls, who used power not to boast, but to balance. He was the 17th Republican President of the United States, the man who guided America through the end of one century's great struggle and into the uncertainty of another. He reminded the world that true strength lies not in domination, but in decency, and that, in victory, humility is the noblest form of triumph.